Every now and then, the religious ask some pretty fair questions, I'll admit, but they're never after the really good, honest answers. Have you noticed that too? Because they don't really care about the answers, especially the ones that atheists give. They care about the reactions that they get from their meal tickets. And today, that's not going to change. Should we believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Not without some really good evidence, and we all know that's not going to happen, don't we? So let's get to the excuses and the bald rationalizations coming up next. Here we go again with another Andy-Banister video without Andy Bannister. Did he just die and nobody noticed? I don't know, because I can't remember the last time on his channel that he was actually in the video. I mean, it doesn't really matter because we get the same level of irrational stupidity from the rest of them, but come on, dude, get on your own channel. Enough said. Anyhow, this is a fair question being asked. Why should I believe in the resurrection of Jesus? And somehow I don't think he's going to have any good answers, but I guess we can only look and see. So let's go do that.
Why should I believe in the resurrection of Jesus? In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul writes that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures.
Who cares? My book says a thing is completely irrelevant. I don't care what your stupid book says. If that's your reason, or any part of your reason, then your reason just sucks. Because Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter, says that Abraham Lincoln killed vampires. That doesn't make it true. The Iliad and the Odyssey mention goddesses like Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Doesn't make them real. The Harry Potter books say that there's a school out there named Hogwarts. That doesn't mean that it's there. So I don't give a shit about your stupid book unless you have objectively verifiable evidence that the things your book talks about are factually true. Your faith means absolutely nothing. It just means that you're a delusional idiot. So can we get to actual evidence? Or is this just going to be a whole lot more religious masturbation?
And that he was raised from the dead 3 days later. And that this is of first importance. He says that the biggest thing, the most important thing about Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead.
Which still doesn't mean anything if you have no evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead. You can't even prove that Jesus ever existed at all. This is where the whole thing is going to go completely sideways because he doesn't care if any of it is actually true. This is just, let me tell you some of the comforting stories that I believe so you can keep throwing money our way. And that is blatantly dishonest. This kind of stuff needs to be handled at a much higher level than Steve Osmond and his give me your cash begging. Because ultimately, that's all any of this is. You have to be better, and these people never ever are. And that's sad, isn't it?
So is there any good reason to believe that this is true? Well, where do we have the resurrection of Jesus recorded?
Hold on, Tex. Let me just head you off at the pass. My book says a thing. You have stories in a book of mythology with no external corroboratory evidence whatsoever to back any of them up. That is not impressive. Sorry. You do not have a single demonstrable contemporary eyewitness account anywhere for any of the events of Jesus' supposed life. You can't even prove that he existed at all. All you can do is believe, and believing is not enough. It will never be enough. This is how you know that he's not talking to anyone but the drooling desperate in the pews, because no one outside of his cult cares about his ridiculous book. I'm not looking for confirmation bias. I care about actual evidence. You know, the stuff that you can't get in a book. Got any of that? Well, of course you don't. And so long as that's the case, you will continue to fail. Not that you care, because the people that you're trying to con, they don't care either. You're all a bunch of irrational idiots.
That's in the New Testament, in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are biographies. They're called the Gospels, and they're biographies of Jesus' life, of his ministry, his life, his death, and his resurrection.
And they're nothing remotely of the sort. They are anonymously written tall tales written by demonstrable non-eyewitnesses to anything, just recording their take on a decades-long game of telephone that had been going around the irrational believers for a very long time. Actual eyewitnesses don't need to copy verbatim from other sources like most of the Gospels do. They are a statement of faith, not fact. They are there to sell a bill of goods to people gullible enough to fall for it. You know, people like Steve there. They aren't actual history, and the second that you realize that, the entire case for a real historical Jesus falls apart. There is no defensible reason whatsoever to think that Jesus existed at all, and for the sake of argument, that doesn't mean anything. I only care about for the sake of fact, and they have none. So this isn't starting off well at all, not that we really expected it to, because Steve only has one audience in mind, the one that pays his salary. Truth is completely irrelevant, and that's what makes this all such a complete waste of time.
The question is, do we have any reason to believe that the accounts are actually true?
Nope, not external reasons anyhow, and that's what you need. I don't care what anyone says. I care what they can back up with objectively verifiable evidence that anyone can look at and determine for themselves if it's true, and we all know that Steve has none of that. Steve doesn't care though, because as I said, he's only here to confirm the biases of the people already in the pews. He's not making this video for us. None of them are. Yet, aren't we the ones that he should be convincing? Isn't it his job to spread the word and convert the world? How does he expect to do that with piss-poor nonsense like this? And of course, he doesn't really care because he's only in this to pad his bank account. The Great Commission went out the window in the Middle Ages when the clergy class realized that there was money in them there suckers, and they've been living off it ever since. They don't care one bit if any of it is true. They only care what's in it for them. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, should it?
Well, let me give you just 3 reasons why I think we can believe that these accounts are accurate and true.
I'll certainly let him get there, although I have no confidence whatsoever in anything that Steve has to say. We've seen this all before, more than likely. It's not going to work if he's going to expect me to have faith in the Bible, though, since that hasn't been demonstrated to be worthwhile yet, and I'm sure he's not even going to try. None of them do. They just assert it, but do not demonstrate it in any objectively verifiable way, and that's the problem. This reminds me of a Dan McClellan video that I saw earlier today, where he was responding to a claim that they knew the date of the fall of Jericho because they interpreted the Bible to say that there was an eclipse and they could only find one possible eclipse during the time frame that they were looking for, so that just had to be it. Except the Bible doesn't say an eclipse at all. It says the sun stopped in the sky. And you just have to trust that the Bible story is true at all in order to come to any of the conclusions that they want. Again, this is just pure confirmation bias. That's all Steve is going to be doing here. Well, if we read it in a way that we can twist it to make it look remotely like something in the Bible is true, that just confirms that something in the Bible is true, right? No. It doesn't. Not at all. Not even close. You have to confirm the Bible first, with demonstrable evidence, and you're not even trying to do that. Assuming that the Bible is true doesn't make the Bible true. It just makes you look like a moron. Stop it. Seek help.
The first is that they include embarrassing details.
Doesn't matter. Why? because the people who wrote the Gospels were not the people to whom they were later attributed. There is no reason whatsoever to think that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that wrote them down. And in fact, there's lots of reasons that we know that couldn't have been true. This goes back to Papias, and we all know what a liar he was. I mean, we can go back to Eusebius, who himself was known as a liar, but even he had little respect for the intellect of Papias. Other early church fathers never mentioned the supposed authors of the Gospels because they weren't known in big air quotes, until Papias. At least most likely, since we don't know for sure, but that's where all the evidence points. Papias just made it all up. It was designed to give them a false sense of legitimacy. There is no evidence whatsoever that any of it is true.
Now, what's that all about? There's something called the principle of embarrassment.
And it still doesn't matter because the people who wrote the Gospels were not the people who they were later attributed to. Who is getting embarrassed here? Certainly no one that can be tied to the actual writing. Therefore, saying they wouldn't have written it down knowing that it would show them in a bad light is completely meaningless because the Gospels were all written anonymously. Nobody wrote down, "Hey, I'm Joe Blow and this is my story." So the principle of embarrassment doesn't apply in this case unless you assume, without evidence, that you know who wrote the damn things. And you don't. There's more that I could say here, but I want to see where he goes to see if he stumbles into any of it. So let's get back to Steve, already in progress.
When you go to a court of law, or if you speak to a detective or investigator, they'll tell you that there's something called the principle of embarrassment. And so if you're investigating a crime that happened or an account, and if someone sheds themselves in a poor light in an embarrassing way, the chance is that they're actually telling the truth.
Not remotely true. This is still assuming that you're talking to eyewitnesses and not just some random people who put together a retelling of a giant game of telephone. These are just verbal traditions that believers told each other over time, and eventually they got recorded on parchment by people who were never there to see the real events, if there ever were real events in the first place. This is why faith fails so badly. It's not based on demonstrable facts. We have no way to show that somebody went back and did any kind of research or found verifiable records or anything else that these stories were actually true. This is just fiction that may or may not have been based on some kernel of truth, but we have no way whatsoever to prove what that kernel might have been. We can look through other mythologies and find stories with a kernel of truth. For example, the story of the Trojan War in the Homeric epics that we've talked about before, that has some true elements that the war actually happened, along with pure mythic nonsense like the existence and actions of gods and goddesses. Just because it's found alongside something that actually happened or that you can find evidence for, that doesn't mean that all the rest of it is true. And in neither case can we find the dividing line between fact and fiction. At least we can tell the Trojan War was true because we have actual evidence for that. We have no evidence whatsoever for a historical Jesus. There could have been one. There might not have been. We don't know, and all the faith in the world won't change that. The evidence matters, and here there is none.
Well, why is that? If people are making up a story to make themselves look good or get out of trouble, they're probably not going to shed themselves in a poor light. Imagine there's someone who's driving their car and they're busy texting while they do that and end up plowing into the back of the guy parked in front of them. They get out, a policeman standing on the side comes and says, "Oh, well, what happened here?" And the guy, being very honest, says, "I'm so sorry, officer. I wasn't concentrating at all. I was on my phone, and I know it's a crime, but I was, and I plowed into the back of this guy."
But that only matters because it's someone demonstrably involved. You don't have that with the gospel writers. You have to take that bit on faith because you have no evidence to support it. But if the cop went and asked an onlooker what happened, that person has no reason to lie. they're not embarrassing themselves. They're embarrassing someone else, and they don't care about that. If that onlooker went and wrote a book about the event, and as a stylistic choice, they decided to tell the tale in first person from the perspective of the guy driving, that still doesn't really mean anything, does it? He can tell the truth, he can embellish, he can lie through his teeth. It doesn't really matter because it doesn't come back on him because he's not telling a story about himself. There are plenty of stories in Greek mythology, the Orphic tradition, that are written that way. It's not uncommon. Of course, if you read the Gospels, they're not really written in first person, are they? Where it's, I was there and here's what happened from my perspective. All four Gospels were written in the third person perspective, as if telling a story, not as if relating an experience. It all falls apart the second that you look at it, which clearly Steve has not.
The chances are that that's what happened. And this is what the principle of embarrassment does.
Except it still doesn't. This only works if you make the unwarranted assumptions that Steve is making. He's just assuming that these are all first-hand accounts written by people who are well known as the authors, such that they could be embarrassed by anything that they wrote, and that is simply not the case. Absolutely no one contemporary to the Gospels ever wrote down, yeah, this was written by Joe. We just don't have that. We've never had that. No one has ever claimed to have the documentation on that, even if it was eventually lost to time. You have anonymous stories written by who the hell knows who, eventually named something without evidence for authorship by someone who even the other church fathers didn't respect. It stuck over time because it helped the early church maintain power. This does not seem unlikely. In fact, it makes a whole lot of sense. By the time of Constantine, certainly, he was looking for a way to consolidate power under this new religion of Christianity, and that's been true ever since, hasn't it?
So in the New Testament and the Gospels, if you read them with this kind of eye,
if you read them with all the preconceived notions that you've had shoved into your head by the religion, then you are going to come to the conclusions that they really want you to come to, because that's what they were trying to do in the first place. They are trying to assert control over your thought processes. Welcome to indoctrination. That's why interpretation means nothing. It doesn't matter how you approach the subject, it matters what external evidence you have to defend your views. And of course, the religious have absolutely nothing. That's why it's so important to take yourself and your beliefs and your biases and all the rest out of it so that you can examine the actual facts and come to the most demonstrably reliable conclusion that you can. Sometimes that conclusion is, we don't have a conclusion, which is why faith is so worthless. What you really want to be true doesn't matter. What you can demonstrate is actually true, that does.
You'll see that we have many embarrassing details all the way through. If you look at the disciples, they're always portrayed as being slow and dim-witted. They're rebuked by Jesus, they're rebuked by each other. And one instance of this that really sticks out to me is that...
Let me guess. Peter denying Jesus 3 times. Do I get a cookie? I guess we'll see in a minute. But if this wasn't written by Peter, and nobody even pretends that Peter wrote any of the Gospels, so the principle of embarrassment is entirely irrelevant, isn't it? The apostles are largely just bit characters in the story of Jesus. They're people who can ask the right questions at the right time for the Jesus character to launch into a diatribe and teach a lesson that the anonymous authors of the Gospels thought was worthwhile. It was never about the disciples. It was about the message. All the fiction written around it was just setup. This isn't that hard to understand, is it? At least, it's certainly not for me.
Peter, the Apostle Peter, who goes on to be the leader of the early church in Jerusalem, at one point is called Satan.
Well, I was close. That just shows that I don't watch these things ahead of time. Why would I embarrass myself by getting it less than completely right? Because this whole thing is really just stupid. And when your entire theology is based around everyone is a sinner and you have to kiss Jesus' ass to get saved, why wouldn't you do that? That fits in with the entire scenario. It wasn't Peter who was there to save people. Peter was just holding the money for all the people in the early Christian cult. Because remember, early Christianity was communistic. It was communal. Give up your property and follow Jesus. Well, who wound up with control of that property? The apostles, the church, whoever. It wasn't like it just got given away and everybody lived in poverty. The clergy then, like today, benefited from the charitable giving of the believers. They got their needs taken care of wherever they went. That's not to say that early apologists didn't believe it. They probably did, but they were being cared for by the community, and it's not hard to see that as a benefit, right? It's also not hard to see that growing into, hey, this is actually a pretty good scam. If we keep telling people these stories, we're going to make out like bandits. Because it didn't take long for that to take off either, right?
By Jesus. Now, if you're trying to make up a religion, as the charge would be, to get fame and power and all the things that come along with it, you are not going to make up some account in which your leader of the early church is called Satan by your leader. That's just not going to happen. And so the best explanation is that that is recorded as the way things happened.
But that still only works if you hold the beliefs that you do, beliefs that you cannot independently corroborate. This is just confirmation bias.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
This is you telling yourself stories that get you where you really want to be. That's not a rational way to behave, but they don't really care about rationality, do they? They just really want it to be true. Now, you notice what's happening here, at least so far, right? He has no actual evidence. He's just trying to convince you to buy into the bullshit in the Bible because he really wants it to be true. The only thing that's going to convince me that Jesus rose from the dead is objectively verifiable evidence, though. I don't care about your book. I don't care about your faith. I don't care about your beliefs. You've got a long way to go before I accept your book as true, all of it requiring massive amounts of evidence. It would be easier to just focus on providing evidence for Jesus in the first place. But he's not going to do that, is he? None of these arguments, I'm sure, will remotely address that. This is not about evidence. This is about faith, and faith means nothing. So let's finish up the first claim, and we'll let it go for the week. Geez, this has been concentrated stupid so far, hasn't it? And that's not exactly a surprise.
And that principle then applies to the New Testament. It is full of these embarrassing details all over the place. And these are then a pointer to the truthfulness of the accounts. If you're going to make up a religion for fame, glory, power, whatever it is, you wouldn't include all of the embarrassing details that we see in the New Testament.
And I've already explained why that's not true. Not that Steve cares or anything, because Steve is only in this for cash and control, not remotely for the facts. And this is about the time that we need to look at the video itself, because I still find it endlessly interesting. Now, Andy has a very, very small channel. He's sitting at less than 5,000 subscribers, but this video, which at the time I write this, came out 8 months ago, has only had 225 views, and of those, only 8 upvotes. I get several times that many views and many times that many upvotes in a single day most of the time, with only about half as many subscribers. And I don't turn my comments off like Andy does. So what is Andy doing wrong? Well, he's a religious channel, that's what. Most of them seem to have that problem, even the big ones. Lots of people might subscribe, but hardly anyone actually consumes the content. Most viewers are atheists who only do it to laugh, which I figure is why he turns off his comments, so he doesn't get completely roasted. And that's just sad, isn't it? Granted, some people might ask why I don't have tons of subscribers, but that's because I don't care. I'd rather have a small number of people who actually watch than lots of people who click a button and never do. Then again, I'm not doing this to make money or to influence people. Subscribe and watch if you want. I don't care. Don't if you don't want. I don't care. It's all the same to me. But for Andy, who supposedly wants to bring people to Christ, he's doing a piss poor job of it, isn't he? Whereas I only want to say what I want to say, and if people want to come along for the ride, hey, that's fine too. I have no end goal here. I'm just doing it because I want to. At least I'm honest about it. What do you think about that? Go ahead and let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you all next time.